Have you ever thought, is this just me when struggling to stay organized, start tasks, or manage time? For those of us over 50, these challenges might not be just aging. They could be ADHD hiding in plain sight for decades. I'm Jami Shapiro, host of Grandma Has ADHD, and I'm building a community where your experiences matter. Whether you're diagnosed, questioning, or simply curious, you're not alone. Our Facebook group is filled with vibrant, understanding people over 50 who share their stories, strategies, and yes, even their struggles, with plenty of laughter along the way. Ready to find your people? Join our growing Grandma Has ADHD Facebook community. Please like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen and share it with someone who might need to hear they're not alone, because ADHD doesn't have an age limit and neither does understanding yourself better. Together, we're changing the conversation about ADHD after 50. Come be part of the story. Hi, this is Jami, and I want to make a note before you listen to this podcast. I have been enrolled in the personal transformation course through ADCA, which is AID Coaches Academy, and the term rejection sensitive dysphoria came up in one of my classes. The instructor was really emphatic that we not use the word dysphoria. And I really agreed with what he said. So I want you to hear this conversation. When you hear me use rejection sensitive dysphoria, please take the word dysphoria out and just think of it as rejection sensitivity. Those of us with ADHD are definitely more sensitive to rejection, and I am doing my part to really do all I can to destigmatize ADHD, and I don't think that using the word dysphoria is in that effort. So listen with those new ears, and thanks so much for tuning in. Hi. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different because I was supposed to have a guest on who I admire very much, and she was a no-show, which was something that I decided, well, I could, just go ahead and move about my day, or I could sort of share my experience and talk a little more about rejection sensitive dysphoria. Rejection sensitive dysphoria is also called RSD, and it is something that I am just realizing almost always occurs with ADHD. And I thought that maybe I didn't have RSD, but I am realizing that just like ADHD exists on a spectrum, so does rejection sensitive dysphoria. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what AI says rejection sensitive dysphoria is, so you have a good understanding. And then I'm going to share, my experience of rejection sensitive dysphoria. Okay, so I'm going to give you some facts, not going to be as exciting. It's a little bit heavy, but I think it's really going to open the doors for you to examine your own life and see, where this might be showing up for you. So the definition is it's a phenomenon characterized by an intense emotional response to perceived rejection or criticism. Make sure you hear that word perceived. Individuals with RSD experience significant distress and emotional dysregulation in response to even minor social slights or perceived failures. The symptoms include intense emotional pain and distress, overreaction to criticism or rejection, hypersensitivity to social cues, fear of being judged or rejected, low self-esteem and self-doubt, difficulty managing relationships, sudden outbursts of anger, sadness, or shame. They don't know the cause of rejection-sensitive dysphoria, but they do think that it plays into genetics, which ADHD plays into genetics, early childhood experiences, and we're going to talk a little bit about which came first, the chicken or the egg, neurochemical imbalances, and then certain mental health conditions such as ADHD and anxiety. So right now, we're going to talk about how you handle this, but I'm going to share a little bit about how rejection-sensitive dysphoria shows up for me and a little bit about how it shows up for people that I know and love. So I'll just tell you that I was listening to a book called Small Talk by Roxanne Pink, She and her husband, Richard Pink, have written a book. It's their second book. It's called Small Talk, and it is about the way that people ADHD talk to themselves. And it's been probably one of the best ADHD books that I have listened to. I tend to listen to books. I am able to retain them. A lot of people with ADHD will say that they can read the same page over and over again and they just can't absorb it. Well, that is absolutely the case for me. So I do better when I am listening to a book and I can almost remember where I was when I heard a certain part, especially if it stuck with me. But she starts talking about her experience with rejection sensitive dysphoria. And I would not say that I overreact to criticism or rejection, but again, that's my perception. And I think I'm pretty good with social cues. But so I sort of dismissed it thinking, oh, I don't have it. And then I started to, as I heard Roxanne share her story, I started to think back to my childhood. And I'll give you an example of what rejection sensitive dysphoria looked like for me. And I'm just going to just call it RSD going forward. I don't have to keep saying the whole thing. But when I was younger, I remember having this fear that people wouldn't like me. And I remember going to play with my friends and leaving behind favorite toys. And in my mind, I remember thinking, oh, if I leave my favorite toy for them, then they'll like me. So clearly, this was going on. I remember starting a new camp or preschool. I know where it was. I just don't know how old I was. And I remember bringing candy to everybody in the hopes that they would like me and like, here, M&Ms make friends. So, clearly that was showing up for me young. And in relationships, as I started to learn about attachment theories, and, that's a very big term in today's world, especially, millennials, Gen Xers, and people who are dating, learning about our attachment styles. So the three main attachment styles are avoidant attachment, anxious attachment, and the one that's like got it together. I can't remember what that attachment style is. But what I will tell you is I have an anxious attachment style, which means that I am always sort of waiting for that other shoe to drop. And in a relationship, I need more reassurance than the average person does. And I always attributed that to my childhood where I felt rejected. And so just to give you a little bit of my backstory, my mom and dad divorced when I was 1. And my mother, just really had a hard time with me. And as we've shared in this podcast, she struggled with her own mental health. And a challenge came up for her when I was around 3 years old. And she felt that it would be better to send me to live with my father, who was stable. He was going back to college on the GI Bill. And he was married. And my mom thought that the best thing that she could do, rather than try to raise me, was to send me to live with my father and his wife. And I understand that very much as a parent, how, she felt that she was making the best decision for me. And then it turns out that my stepmother was abusive. So, and I remember being punished for, one that sticks in my mind is I remember my report card would say, N for needs improvement, for talking too much in class. And I remember one of my punishments having to sit in my room and just write sentence after sentence. And, I will not talk too much in class. I will not talk too much in class. I will not talk too much in class. My brother, who's been on the show, has told me that so we're half siblings, and he has spoken with his aunts who sort of have apologized about our childhood, because she wasn't just abusive to me. She was also abusive to him. And she'd shared with him that I would get locked in a closet when I was misbehaving. And I did block that out. But I definitely remember making little mistakes all the time and constantly feeling like something was wrong with me. So when I go into these relationships, I have, and there's also this theory that if you have issues with your mother, that really sets the tone for your future relationships. And although, again, I have forgiven my mother, I know she did the best that she could, I would say that gave me this anxious feeling. And so I've always found it very difficult to trust in a relationship. And so oftentimes I would sort of put up the barrier and I would leave that relationship before they could reject me. But when I do feel comfortable with somebody, as I do in my current relationship, or, with my marriage, I was able to let that person know, hey, I'm feeling anxious. And, thankfully I'm with a partner who, reassures me, and I've been able to build a better attachment style. And I'm losing I'm having an ADHD Swiss cheese memory moment that I can't remember what that normal attachment style is, but it's just, normal, but it's not the right word. So that is a little bit about how I show up in relationships. But, this is one of the things that kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. And that is that whenever I get a phone call, so I own my own business. As I've shared, I own Silver Linings Transitions, and we are a move management and home organizing business in San Diego. Actually, I'm going to take a step back. Prior to starting Silver Linings Transitions and the other jobs that I've had in San Diego, I actually was working as a realtor in Florida, and I was a very good realtor. I was usually getting, a top performer, but I really enjoyed working with the clients that I helped, and I'm really honest. One of my core values is integrity, and I felt like I was a very good realtor, but the part of the job that I hated was the rejection. And I can remember, when you are a realtor, yes, you're selling the product, but you're really selling yourself. You're selling confidence in who you are and your ability to represent your client. And that was quite honestly probably one of the biggest reasons that I left real estate. Even though it was a very lucrative career, I could not handle, the rejection. So, I see that showing up in my work. I remember when I was a buyer for Steinmart before I had my oldest child, and I always worried about being fired. I always was worried about being in trouble, which I think, goes back to my childhood. And, so step forward as I was sharing with Silver Linings Transitions in the very beginning, when I started the company more than 10 years ago, I was the face of the company, the sales of the company. I was on every job. And so, of course, I took it very personally, although I will say less personally than I did as a realtor, because we were providing a service and it wasn't just me. And even to this day, while I am no longer on jobs and I'm not in the day-to-day the way that I was, when I get a phone call from somebody that refers business to us or anybody that is sort of influential, and they leave me a message, or text me, Jami, can we talk? Can you call me? I immediately go to, we did something wrong. So I am really seeing this rejection sensitive dysphoria playing out in my own life. I am going to take a short break because, as I've shared, one of the powers behind my podcast is supporting my business in San Diego, Silver Linings Transitions. And so I'm going to take a quick break and let you know a little bit about what it is that we do. I also don't want to forget to ask you, I am building a community of like-minded people on Facebook. It's called Grandma Has ADHD. You can find us on Facebook, because what I am doing is creating a movement. I am creating a movement for all of the seniors, and I'm going to define seniors as 50 or over, because as I learned in my certified senior advisor course, the average age that someone becomes a grandparent is at the age of 50. And coincidentally, without knowing that, I had decided that the podcast was really going to be geared to people who were 50 and over, because we're sort of being left out of that ADHD conversation. But as I shared, you don't have to be a grandparent. It's just a really catchy name. So I'm going to stop the tangent. I'm going to take a pause, and then we're going to come back, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about rejection sensitive dysphoria, RSD, how I see it showing up in my life with my family members. And then we're going to talk about what you can do. Ever wondered why helping a loved one declutter feels like speaking different languages? I did, especially with my mom. It wasn't until I founded Silver Linings Transitions, helping San Diego seniors organize and move for over a decade, that I discovered why. We all experience clutter differently, and for those of us with ADHD, it's a whole other world. If you are listening in the San Diego area and feeling stuck with moving, paperwork, photos, or home organization, our team at Silver Linings Transitions gets it. We understand ADHD's unique challenges, and we won't just help you get organized. We'll create sustainable systems that finally stick. Schedule a consultation with our team today at 760-522-1624. That's 760-522-1624, or find us at silverliningstransitions.com. And we are back. So I was actually thinking about it while I took the pause that even doing a solo episode for me really plays into my rejection sensitive dysphoria, because if you don't listen to this podcast, then it's not me and someone else. It's all me. So I'm just being really vulnerable, because one of the things that I have discovered in my life is that when I am vulnerable and I share who I am, then that gives you space to share who you are. And I don't carry shame. I don't carry shame about my ADHD. In fact, as I've shared very openly, I'm really proud of my ADHD. ADHD is not a choice I made. It isn't something, that I got to select from a vending machine. It is the natural course of how I was born. And I'm not going to get into my woo-woo side, although I absolutely have one. And I do believe we are all here for a purpose. We are here in service of other people. And, I definitely believe that I have ADHD for a reason. And I'm not going to beat myself up for all of the things that I can't do. I am going to really dive into the things that I can do and that I'm naturally good at. And, I will say one area where I feel very confident is speaking and writing. I mean, that is something that I don't need anybody else's approval. I have enough self-esteem in that category that I feel like I'm here for that reason. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about rejection sensitive dysphoria and how it shows up in my life with other people. So my mom, and this is a sensitive subject, but my mom, as I've shared, is the original grandma, and we didn't realize that she had ADHD until she was almost 77 years old. And she lived her entire life without knowing. And, that's a subject that I've shared and will continue to share with guests. But I remember as a child, my mother unleashing her emotions on me, and I was not equipped to handle those emotions at a young age. I never really felt comfortable with the tears. I'm really great with joy and celebrating with people, but I'm not comfortable when people are upset. And my mom and I, we've had this history, and I'm sure that this happens for other mothers and daughters, but something will happen and it will explode into something that it didn't need to be. And now looking back, we just had an episode while she was in town visiting for my birthday. And we had something come up, and then that escalated. And it's been a dance between the two of us. And now that I look back, I think it was probably RSD playing its head. I'm not speaking with my father. My brother and I both aren't speaking with our father. And I don't want to air anything about him because he hasn't given me any permission to discuss him. But I would say that I think that a lot of the reason that we aren't speaking might be, again, to his perception of things that might not be accurate. And that is definitely one of the things that I want this platform to do, is to help people with ADHD to recognize that sometimes in the relationships that we have, that these tough relationships, sometimes that person is really coming from this extreme place of perception that really might not be right, but it is that ugly trick that our brains play with us. I remember my child Will in second grade, and this was actually conveyed to us like a parent-teacher conference, because Will really struggled in school, not academically, but socially. And, we came to learn later that Will had ADHD, and that social anxiety is a very common co-occurrence with ADHD. And I remember the teacher giving us an example of what that looked like. And this was so interesting. So the teacher was reading a story. All the kids were sitting on the mat, and the character in the book had a striped sweater. Well, Will was wearing a striped sweater that day also. And for the rest of the day, everybody called Will the name of the character in the book, which wasn't a compliment or an insult. But to Will, they took it very, very hard. And that, like putting pieces back together. I love Steve Jobs' quote that you can never see your life looking forward. It's only when you look back. And this was if you haven't ever seen the Stanford commencement address with Steve Jobs, I highly recommend it. Again, squirrel. But, looking back on some of the things that I can remember, I can see these cases of rejection sensitive dysphoria playing out. So I'm sharing what rejection sensitive dysphoria looks like for me. In the story, I was sharing small talk with Roxanne Pink. She talks about being in her relationship and not wanting to let her partner know things about her because she was afraid that he wouldn't accept them. And one of the things that she says is, and it's definitely something that I'm starting to pause, is people with ADHD, we get so many negative messages growing up. And especially for those of us who didn't know, is it the negative messages that built into our head that we are bad or that something is wrong or that we're going to be rejected? Or is it, just a natural cause of having ADHD? I don't have the answer to that, but I do know that people with ADHD receive way more negative messages as children. And I don't know if you've ever heard this, but I definitely have heard it in a lot of the studying that I've done, that we take in those negative messages far more than we keep those positive ones. And we have to give so many more positive messages to negate those negative messages. I will say too, my youngest daughter, who was just diagnosed with ADHD, and again, putting all the pieces together, we can never have a conversation with her where anything negative is said. And I now am putting, again, the pieces together that she just is hypersensitive to rejection. So we've talked a little bit about the causes, and we've talked a little bit about what it looks like. And I will even tell you, like with this podcast, the guest that didn't show is, I'm like, is it me? And I start going in that rumination in my head, which is a very common issue that we have with ADHD. Anyway, it is not currently a recognized medical diagnosis, but it is a well-known phenomenon among clinicians and therapists. So what they suggest, if you have RSD and if you have ADHD, I would say you probably have some version of that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is one of the ways that we can treat it. Some people advocate for medication. I am very clear on this podcast that I am not taking a stand on medication in either direction. I am not a doctor. And I will say that people over 50 don't have as many options when it comes to medication because of polypharmacy, which basically means that we're taking other drugs and we have other issues and we don't know how those drugs are going to interact if we take them. But mostly it's skills to develop coping mechanisms. And one of the things that I have to do is sort of step back and recognize, is this true? There was Byron Katie, I think is her name. She wrote, I don't remember the name. Here you go again. But she wrote a book, Is This True? How do I know that it's true? And I think that is one of the things that we need to do with rejection sensitive dysphoria. And also have a safe person that you can discuss these things with. Am I overreacting to this? Because sometimes we really are overreacting. I definitely have had a lot of those conversations with my friends, with my boyfriend now. And it's really been helpful for me to get a perspective. And it's interesting too, because my mom always said that I was the person that I would take a poll on every single decision, but also just needing that reassurance, like, hey, am I on the right path with this? So those are some of the things that you can do to treat RSD. And then according to Claude, how do we live with RSD? Because, I don't think that we're going to cure it, but it is manageable. From what I understand, it's one of the most manageable parts of ADHD. It's, again, to develop coping mechanisms for dealing with rejection. And I will say this, I tell my kids when something bad happens that they are building their resiliency muscle. And there is an expression that Mark Twain had, which is, it's called eating the frog. And he says that basically the first thing you want to do in the morning is eat the frog. And that means that that's like the really hard thing that you're going to have to do, that thing that you're avoiding doing. And he says, if you start your day doing the hardest thing, then the rest of your day will be easier. And even going back to rejection sensitive dysphoria, because, these ideas pop. I remember my oldest child, Will, would not feel comfortable even going into a pizza or a sub shop and ordering food. They had to go with one of their sisters to do that. So, I don't know how much of that is the rejection sensitive and social anxiety, but you can definitely see where social anxiety would play into, or rejection sensitive dysphoria would play into social anxiety, because if you're always worried that people aren't going to like you, then you don't want to be around people or put yourself in a situation where you can be rejected. And I think there are probably a lot of people who avoid relationships for that reason, because it's more comfortable to avoid the pain than to put yourself out there and risk it. She says, or Claude says, challenge negative thoughts and beliefs, which, I should have shared. Strong social support networks, or a strong system. And Dr. Ned Hallowell, who is one of my idols in the ADHD space, talks about vitamin C, and that's connection being the most vital part of any of life, not just neurodivergent, but typical as well. But finding your tribe. And I will say, I love being with other ADHD people. I love hosting a podcast with other ADHD people, because there is so much room to take off my mask. And in ADHD, this is a term that when people have ADHD, we sort of mask the behaviors or who we really are. And then we are able to sort of just like let go and breathe when we feel comfortable. And I compare this to my grandmother. I was very close with my grandmother. And every Thursday night, I would go to her house. And this was back in the 90s. And we would watch the Thursday night lineup. I think it was like Ally McBeal and it doesn't matter, Friends. But I would go to her house. I would come from work and I would take off all my work clothes, including my bra. And I would get into my grandma's, I called them her muumuus, one of those house coats. And we would sit on her chairs and we would watch television together. And that feeling of like taking off your bra and just like being free is how I would equate that feeling of the mask and the masking. It's holding it all together and then letting it go. So when we are with other people who have ADHD and understand us, then all of a sudden we can be exactly who we are. And it's okay to say to somebody with ADHD, hey, I'm running late, whatever. But so I would say finding your tribe is critical because that mask can get to be very tight. Seek professional help when needed. I'm always an advocate for therapy, coaching, if that's applicable. You can find an ADHD coach through ADCA, ADDCA. I think it's .com. But it's, or you can also, we'll have the show notes linked in this podcast. It's really important to learn to regulate your emotions and manage your stress. So one of the things that I know to be true is that when you're feeling those feelings and that feeling of anxiety in your chest is to take a step back. It's really hard for people with ADHD to meditate. I preach it, but I don't necessarily practice it, but I am able to do a little bit of box breathing. And if you don't know what box breathing is, I'm going to take you really quickly through a very brief version of it so that you have an understanding. But basically, you're breathing in a box. So you will take, an inhale on the same count. So saying inhale 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you hold that breath in for 4. So you're not breathing in, you're not breathing out. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you exhale on the count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you hold empty on the count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that box breathing will regulate, how you're feeling and will help you when you're in that fight, flight, freeze amygdala brain. It will help you to regulate. And so being aware of what you can do in your body to regulate. There's also mindfulness. I've heard the example of getting a tangerine or something and being able to hold the tangerine, look at it, feel its bumps, smell the tangerine, and then feel peeling that tangerine. So it's an action, and then tasting it, and then really, but being present in that moment that you're in. I love the expression, and it's so true, that anxiety is when we worry about the future and depression is when we dwell on the past, and how when I am in this moment, I am safe. I am not, nothing is coming at me. I am okay. And I will get through it. And then most importantly, you have got to be kind to yourself. And as I've shared, most of us with ADHD, I'd say none of us with ADHD chose to have ADHD. All we can do is manage it. And as I like to say, what we resist persists. So leaning into your ADHD, being open, and that's definitely one of my platforms, being open about this is me, this is who I am. And as I share, especially in our older, which is 50 and over listeners and community, you should feel especially proud because you have cobbled it together. It was interesting, again, back to the book Small Talk that I was listening to. I love that Richard, her husband, he sounds like the perfect ADHD partner. And I'd say mine is a pretty good one. But he talks about what he does for his wife when she is going through some of the emotional dysregulation. And that one of the things that he will do is just hug her and hold her. I know a lot of people with ADHD, for instance, sleep with weighted blankets. And I remember before we knew that my youngest daughter had ADHD, and I remember when she would just go out of her mind. And in the beginning, I would lock her out of my room because I couldn't handle it. It was just too much. And then eventually we both came to realize that what she really needed me to do was just to stand and hold her tight and just hug her. And so when I heard him say that, I was like, wow, we sort of figured that out on our own. And that's, back to what I was saying, that if you have ADHD and you are here, you have, we have brains that aren't the same as everybody else's. And we have had to figure out how to navigate in a world that is at least 90% neurotypical. So giving yourself self-acceptance and compassion. And again, if you have that negative voice, and we talk about this a lot because it's really one of the biggest problems with ADHD is the way that we talk to ourselves. So take that voice outside of yourself and put it on trial or defend that bully. Like, you're not going to talk to me that way, and I don't deserve that, and you don't deserve that. So thank you so much for being part of the Grandma Has ADHD community. I would really appreciate it if you would leave a review and if you would share it with your friends. It is a growing movement. You're going to be hearing more and more about seniors with ADHD. We have largely been left out of the conversation, and I am doing everything that I can to change that, because aging doesn't mean that you don't get to continue to grow and make the rest of your life the best of your life. The opinions expressed on Grandma Has ADHD podcast are those of our guests and hosts and are intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. This podcast does not provide medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The content discussed in this episode is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician, mental health professional, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental health concern. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or emergency services immediately. The host, guests, and producers of Grandma Has ADHD do not assume any liability for the content of this podcast. Listen at your own discretion.